Okay. I think we're live. I think so. Welcome, SOLI Deo Gloria. So, in the spirit of going a little bit back to basics, like we were yesterday, and after yesterday, I had a lot of inspiration to go a little deeper into a more simplified way for us to understand some of the negative stuff that I talked about yesterday. Some of the ways that I spoke about it, I realized after that it was good how it came out, but there were things I could have offered that really help with things. So we'll get into that a little bit after, because it all relates back to ego, and actually the rebirth of Christ, or the resurrection of Christ and Christ consciousness, and how that works. Really, it's all part of a big giant system of harmony that's happening in the universe. So it's really interesting, a really deep discussion, even though it is about sort of foundational things. And we talk about the ego so much. It's kind of annoying, which I'll also get into the annoying aspects of it. But the reason that those annoying aspects are so important, like the reason that process, or what I call the turbulence of the rebirth or the awakening. So we can see the ascension, actually, or awakening process, as the rebirth of Christ as well. It's the same one and the same thing. And I specifically put a woman on the front of this, on the thumbnail, to show, like, it's kind of like a fire angel woman, to help dispel some of the weird thoughts that some people still have about, like, Christ and how it's something to do with masculinity or something like that. It's actually more like, in my experience, it's more like embracing the femininity. So even women in our society have challenges with embracing their own femininity, right? Due to the patriarchy and all these other things. There's a whole heap of reasons for that. But we can see that in our society. So actually, the Christ is more, I would say, more like our masculine self is accepting the femininity of spirit. The love, unconditional love of the nurturing mother is more what I would say is actually happening. It's more like we're awaking our inner divine mother to birth the Christ. This is how the birthing process works, and how all the female mysteries way back, which essentially were lost due to being persecuted for this process, essentially learning how to have immaculate conception, believe it or not. Some of it was immaculate and some of it was not immaculate, but it was essentially done to birth Christed beings that would be basically awake and at that frequency. It was a magical process. So if you think about anything you create, of course it makes sense that a holy priestess could create a Christed entity within its womb, right? Does that make sense? Essentially, an entity that's prepared or has gone through, it allows that vessel to contain an exalted consciousness at birth, and a consciousness that's prepared to go through whatever initiation, someone like Buddha, for example. And it's not the name Mary as well means essentially queen. It's symbolic, right? It's symbolic of everything. And isn't it interesting how the Creator sort of makes sure that all of this symbolism's there? Certainly people made up a lot of things, but part of the reason that things are made up is to make sure symbolism's there. But anyways, so yeah, Immaculate Conception's real. That's a thing. That's certainly a thing. But let's clarify first. I've just sort of rambled. But, thank you for joining. I'm so grateful to have you here. Appreciate you. Let's clarify ego. Like, what is ego? And does the ego die even? There's a lot of different teaching about this. So I'll just share my stance on this and the way that I've found helpful to look at this, and that I think is a closer to truth than some of the teachings that I see around. Though I'm not intending to argue with anyone. However we see this is fine. But I'm hoping to navigate us away from areas that are not going to aid us in our advancement. Get right to the meat of things, which is essentially where we feel distorted in separation, which is what informs lack beliefs, fear beliefs, negative beliefs about ourselves. All comes from that same source. So noticing where that is and then getting rid of that. Knowing that ego itself continues on, but I tend to call it, because of the way ego's felt here, the way people think of ego here is like it's a bad thing. The ego's a bad thing. It technically continues and it becomes more just what I call persona or identity. In order for the actor to do things in consciousness, there's usually needing to be some type of identity to do. Otherwise, one is more just in that void of allness. They're not doing, they're just being. But they're not being with a costume on, right? So if they don't have if consciousness isn't wearing a costume, consciousness has no form to take, is another way to think of it. So we're walking around with these garbage costumes. We're wearing garbage bags. And like, we all look like maniacs, more or less. Most of us, because we're quite confused about like what we are. And so it's really important just to first be like okay with it. Be like, yeah, I do kind of think I'm a body, right? And stuff like that. And it's okay. It's all okay. It's all okay. This is why these conversations are so annoying to us, as well as the ego. The ego hates that we're noticing it. The ego does not want to be seen. When it's seen, that's what causes it to. I just like to think of it, instead of death, it's retiring. And the ego is not. I say it hates to be seen. It part of its like programmatic being is to not be seen. Like it's meant to be subversive. It's meant to be this aspect of it. It's shadow, right? Is another way we could look at it. Shadow. It's meant to be subtle, not really able to notice it, but influencing us. And so that's how it operates. So when it's seen, it's like, oh, it's almost like this. It's almost like this. When we see ego, ego's like, look, a distraction. That's basically how it works. And then we go, we might be watching this video and be like, God, this guy's annoying or something, right? And then we're like, oh yeah. Wow. Oh, I hate what he's saying right now or something like that. That's pretty common when we're watching like spiritual stuff, to get kind of frustrated and that type of thing. It's kind of annoying. But so it's not truly different, ego and persona and identity. It's not really that different. The costume that we're wearing gets more and more invested with the mind of God, right? Or it's playing the roles that it plays. The costumes that we wear are more divinely constructed, is how I like to see it. They're more holy, sacred. And all that truly means, instead of thinking in like religious terms of what that might mean, like, oh, you don't say a bad word, or like, that's not the case. It's all about heart intention and peace. So we even want to clean up some of those concepts we have around what we've picked up from society, basically, around what God is. And all of this, actually, that's a good place to start, is where we're limited, where we believe we are limited, and where we believe in our fear, and where we believe in lack. This is where we also believe that God lacks. God creates fear, or is based upon foundations of punishment and judgment. This is essentially the foundations of those beliefs are what construct our perception of self that is lackful. when we're created in God's image, it means that also our mental image of what God is forms what our belief creates as, and that's what we then perceive in the world. We only really see what we believe. So the primary aspect of awakening, or the quickest way that I've seen, is to notice that we choose our own thoughts just as much as we choose anything that arrives to our body, to our mind, to whatever. We choose what we want to engage in. We have sovereignty in ourselves to choose what we're participating in, and we have to have responsibility for what we choose to participate in. And in order for us to do that, we just have to basically be okay with it, notice it, and be okay with it. Otherwise, it gets annoying. It gets very frustrating when we're looking at our ego if we don't want to admit that it's there, right? Basically, looking at, and it's really what we're doing is we're like house cleaning. It should be a good thing. It should be a happy experience to notice, oh, wow, I actually was really, really tied up in something that I didn't really realize it didn't have the power over me I thought it had. Things like that. Like when we get that freedom after we clean that belief up, it feels much, much better. So we can remember that, like every time we do this, it feels better eventually. And I'll get into why that is shortly. But I guess if you have questions or anything you want to add, just throw them into the chat, and then I'll get to them. I'm just going through a bunch of things like usual, and then we'll get into some chit chat. So it all goes back to our relationship with Creator and Spirit, and this is why the cleansing of this aspect of ourselves that is distorted or shadowy is important. This is why some people get kind of attached to the shadow as if it's like an entity as well. And they start to realize that that's where their most of their learning occurs, from going into that aspect of themselves. And then they start to develop an attachment even to it. And so I wouldn't recommend that, but I would recommend knowing that that is where the treasures are. That's where all the unseen shiny things are, basically, are in our shadow. We get the flashlight and we shine it and we're like, oh, there's gold there. And then that's how we transmute, or what they call in alchemy, lead into gold. We just shine the light on the lead until it becomes gold, basically. We look into the shadow and transmute it. And when we do that, every time each egoic, fearful aspect or component to a belief structure falls apart, you can imagine like we have this big framework of belief structures, all cubes perhaps of beliefs, concepts, and things. And some of the cubes are like gross, right? They're dirty and they're messed up. So as soon as we clean one of those up, now Spirit can invest these structures, these concepts with light, enlightening us, literally actually activating DNA now that we start to align with what are called light codes, or can be called that. They could be called really anything, but we start to activate to these light codes in our DNA, which start to harmonize us with different celestial, what's the word? Correspondences, based on the area in our psyche that we've cleaned up. So like you can imagine we have a bunch of floors that we're cleaning up. So when we clean up certain centers, certain areas, we get more in tune with perhaps a exalted Saturn energy, for example, right? And we start to, and it all points all to these different correspondences in the sun, in the stars. And then our sun actually connects into Alcyone and Sirius and can't think of the other one right now. But there's three primary logoi that connect into ours. And I'm still learning about that. It's like they're brothers and sisters of us, or I don't know. But that's why we feel so connected to Pleiadians and Arcturus and those types of things. Sirius. And anyway, I don't know why I'm getting into all that. I tend to ramble. But as those, I guess it makes it's all leading the right way. You know, I still feel strange when I'm just talking like this. It's still weird for me. So bear with me as I learn. I'm semi-channeling state, so it's kind of weird for me. But it all coalesces into this giant system of energy that is all within us, right? It seems to be outside of us, that we like look at the stars and stuff, but it's all within us. In the microcosm exists the macrocosm, is another way to say that. So every time we're clearing up anything like these egoic distortions, we're literally saving the world. Truly, that's truly what we're doing. People that are actively doing their work on themselves spiritually are saving the world. Truly. Everything that they're doing has more value than any physical thing that anyone could ever do here. That's the truth of it. That's the truth of it. And that's why we focus on it so much in spiritual development. You know, it is the thing. It is the thing. But it's also the most annoying. It's sort of like, because it's the thing and so important, we've developed in this particular logos this challenging adversary. It's a product of free will, which I'll get into a little bit in Atlantis and stuff. But it's a product of free will. When we decided we wanted to have a complex universe, that we would have adversarial forces, we could say. Because the people have, just as they have the will to follow God, they also, and the light, they also have a will to decide not to. Like they can decide not to, right? So that creates this force that we essentially are pushing up against all the time with our egoic or separation pains. That's essentially what they are. They're like, you know, and we're going through, that's what are essentially the birthing pains of the Christ. And it seems like that's maybe a fantastic way to put it, but that's what it is. That's what, when people are truly not just trying to like heal their wounds, like where others hurt them, like, I'm talking about when we're really trying to actually notice where we are feeling limited in ourselves and putting our power outside of us. Healing our wounds is there's a process there. Certainly there's a process there, but the wounds themselves are the beliefs that we were wounded, right? We have to go that deep. We have to get right in there and dig it out. Sort of. So there's a lot of people that are doing a lot of emotional work, but they're cycling through the same problem because the belief's not being addressed. And that's, I guess, one of the main reasons that I'm so focused on these things in the channel. And you know, it's like I said, it's frustrating and turbulent for a time. It's the turbulence we actually desire, because it's essentially we hit highs, and then again, the ego is going to come back to us, and we're going to see it really clearly because we're more open, eyes open. We're going to see it more clearly, and it's because we need to see the confusion of a belief that we constructed when we weren't in our right minds, when we were in an insane separation state. We formed a belief, and that's why this is going on. That's why I'm upset by these things. That's truly what it is. If we knew who we were, we would not be able to feel upset about anything, truly. And so we don't set that as like the goal. Like this process usually takes lifetimes. So basically we just set a comfortable pace and go at the pace that feels comfortable. Try to make it cozy, try to make it peaceful through even discovering our ego. I like to make it a little game. Literally, it's like, like when we can notice the ego before we start to react, it starts to be like, oh, isn't that funny? Oh, that's funny. Like, it's more like that. We can get to that. I got there, so I know anyone can get there. If people are having trouble with like getting frustrated when they're noticing ego and trying, some people try, oh, I can't be ego, oh, I don't want to be egoic at all, oh, but they don't understand what the ego is. So they think that all of their identification, it is all identification with self as the limited being, technically, right? And so they think it's all, every time I'm referencing the body, and I've been in this thought process, like whenever I'm referencing me or the body or whatever, I'm like retraining the ego, and it's like it gets very anxious. It's anxious inducing. It's the ego doing that to distract us, basically, and it's working. It's working. When we're mentally disturbed these ways, it's the ego. And I say mentally disturbed, it sounds worse than it is, but essentially, you know, I'm sure some people can relate that, like, even just some conversations, and I've talked about it on the channel, that sometimes conversations are a bit challenging, but we don't want to like justify, or we don't even want to admit that the ego's there at all. Like, we don't want to show it at all or whatever, right? We can get wrapped up in that, and that can be a big like creeping point for the ego to nestle in, essentially, to keep us in an anxious and limited state, fear state, because we're not addressing the belief, really. You know, unless we don't want to, if we do want to shed the ego completely and experience that, then by all means. But most of us are more wanting to craft a Christed presence. So you could say that, like, Buddha showed us the Christ mind through meditative, introspective, contemplative type things, and then Jesus showed us the Christ's way. So the Christ mind, and we want to embody the way, which is just peace, right? It doesn't have to be anything like bananas, like what Jesus was doing. It's so much simpler than that. It's so much simpler, and our minds get all in the way of it. And that's why we want to dismantle these things, that, like, these beliefs that, like, we're waiting for, like, Jesus to, like, come back or something. I don't want to, like, squash anyone's beliefs. I'm just saying that that's putting power outside of yourself, right? Just in the nature of that is based in sort of this concept that somehow Jesus is, like, outside of you, is going to come in and save this stuff. I don't think that thought process makes any true sense when we're talking about our awakening. But it's that turbulence of the up and down, like, we're feeling spiritually high, and then we run into something and we're like, I thought I was doing so good. It's that stuff that we're actually calling into ourselves because we want to purify. We want to, like, the soul's yearning for it, like it's like a magnet to an anvil. It's happening. It's like a mother. It could be termed a force of attraction. It's the birthing process, literally, the Christ being pushed by the natural force out of the womb. That's what causes this turbulence in our experience. And that's where we learn to nurture ourselves with our own source, our own spirit, through the turbulence, which eases the birthing process. Like, the birthing it's like, it's happening, you know? Basically, it's happening. Like, you can't, like, not have it happen. You can't really stop it. You can seem to try to ignore stuff, but it just keeps happening. Like, you can't really step away from it. Your eyes are too open, basically. It's, like, impossible. It's basically impossible. And I always used to say, like, the chosen are the ones who chose. That's what it is. You chose to rebirth the Christ in you. However we want to frame that. Just reawaken to the God self, establish the monad, avatar presence as best we can. You know, I'm not saying we become avatar master level, although we can if we want to. Like, these things are totally achievable by any normal person. Like, by anyone, they're totally achievable and absolutely, like, within the frame of being able to achieve a mastery state within this lifetime, because the souls that are here are old, have done it already probably, and have forgotten. And so it's like, it's almost like I've had these feelings like that amongst the oldest souls here, there's this sort of like, how not how fast, but like how much can that soul remember, like, in this one go. There's this almost like, because there's a camaraderie, right? There's collectives. There's almost like not betting, but it's like this competition of sorts, friendly competition of sorts, to like see who can integrate the most. And I've seen like these beings discussing these things. Like, oh, I was able to get to this. I didn't quite master this or that because I was just too obsessed with eating or something. Just things like that. So it's funny, but I'm not sure why I got into that. But when we learn to nurture ourselves through it, which I use humor to nurture myself through it because I'm able to see that it's funny. Other people might call for love from the mother, or, you know, whatever other positive emotions. Like, literally we can generate this from our own source and spirit through our connection to the Divine Mother, or, you know, Father. I see these as like two polarities or two frequencies of the Creator. Father's like about wisdom, Mother's about nurturing and love. That's about how I see it. And so we can go to whichever energy, right? And so I think that humor seems to be a mixture of love and wisdom. Like, and that's how humor, I think that's why we like humor, is because it's intelligent usually. It makes us think, but it also inspires some type of absurdity in our mind, which we love for some reason. So I think humor is like kind of a good balanced way to like respect that. It also is a good way to like notice the absurdity. That's, I think, why I also use humor, is it seems to be the most effective emotional response to depolarize an egoic thought, like just right in its tracks. Because it's just, it can't have power if it's funny. Can't have power over you if it's just this funny, absurd thing. So we just apply that to any thoughts or feelings or things that are coming up that are implying my lack or lack in others. And we can choose which ones of these that we want to apply this practice to. This digging in practice of like, oh, that's an absurd belief. That does not resonate at all with what I know now of myself. Like, it becomes autonomous that way too. Like, it just happens that way, right? But some people, it helps them to have these perspectives shared, because we're all like approaching these things kind of on our own, right? Like, we have books we read and things, but it's really our own thing. So that's why these talks are usually can be quite helpful for a lot of people. And so right now we're in this divergent, we could call them timelines. It's a divergent timeline, or there is a divergent timeline. In Atlantis, this frequency was called Belial, and there was a group called the Sons of Belial. and they essentially work in that frequency of consciousness. It's been here from, as far as I know, from the beginning of humanity's beginning on Earth. It's been here. It's essentially the adversary, or the source of the adversary. And it's a kind of like I was saying earlier, it's a kind of a required component of free will, that there's an opportunity to act out of harmony with the Creator's will, or with Christ consciousness, which is like an impulse of Christ, or you could think of anything we choose to do. We've received an impulse, and either our impulse is to turn away from Christ's light or to turn towards it. Really, in any moment, that's what's going on, right? It can get that binary. We're either on or we're off. So when we're off, we're tuning into the Belial frequency. It's the liar, the deceiver, the adversary. We're tuning into a false frequency. So that's why it becomes important. You can notice like that if I'm not feeling limited in any way, and then there's people talking about like invasions and things going on, but I'm an unlimited being. So wouldn't that be fantastic to kind of see that? Like, that would be weird, right? That's how I think about that. Like, that would be a wacky experience. I'm not sure that it would be good for people for that to occur. Right? It doesn't sound like that would be a good thing. But as a limited, or as an unlimited, eternal, infinite being, just what could it have to do with me, really? Right? So fear itself starts to become fear what? But we'll still, even though knowing this, like I still have fear. Like I had something, I walked by a dude, and I'm like, that dude has some bad vibes going on. And it spooked me a bit. I was like, woo. And I don't usually have that too bad. But it spooked me. It was just the way he was looking at this woman walking. And I was like, whoa. It's not good. And so my point with that is that my ego was judging the energies that I'm perceiving, right? It was like the identity judging that this is like bad. That guy, I didn't think of him as a bad person, but I thought of him as a potential threat for a moment. Either to me or to the people he's observing, or perhaps in the future, right? And that's where we want to notice these things. Like, and that only just happened to me maybe an hour ago. But then I do this process, right? And I remember that, like, it's reflecting inner parts of me that I'm seeing here. Like, I'm seeing the aspect of masculinity that could be like really like weird with femininity, to try to take it, to try to steal innocence and things like that. The part that's not just in me, like that's in the consciousness of this sphere, that's that input, that impulse, or that antichrist impulse or Belial frequency is there. It's in the consciousness, right? And that's what I'm seeing. It really has nothing to do with these people. And really just what I want to clean up is, okay, I'm seeing what's happening. Like, this guy did have weird vibes. It's not like I made it up. There was a weird thing going on in the energy. But perceiving the threat. Where was the threat, though, right? And the threat was in my belief that my mind understood what should be going on around me, instead of what the life is doing, right? I'm in essence, I'm resisting life for a moment, just to be like, I don't want this. That's where the ego is like getting all crafty with things. And that's where we giggle at it. We're like, yeah, you know, like in the illusion, yeah, there was weird stuff going on, and it's representing things that are not so happy to look at. And, you know, nothing happened at all. It was just a weird energy thing. But there was a lot of confusion about it for a moment, right? The process, like I said, becomes kind of autonomous, and it's pretty quick to identify, because the egoic structures are all like kind of the same. So it's almost like if you solve a Rubik's Cube every day for 100 days, like it's nothing, right? It becomes nothing, right? You just solve the issue. And then it's kind of funny, and then you enjoy it a bit because you know that it's cleaning you up. So now you're gonna feel better. You're gonna feel even better. Cool. I didn't, you know, sometimes I'm like, I didn't know I could feel better, but then I still have the periods of like something's really frustrating me. Like, trying to think. Oh, I had some confusion around who was going to pick my kids up after school one day. And I think I was starting to get ready to do a stream, and then I found out I had to go pick my kids up. And I was like, I wanted to like, just, no, I'm not doing it. Someone else do it, right? That my ego went bananas because it involved the stream and stuff. I don't know, but I went bananas for a second, for like maybe 5 minutes. I was frustrated and all that stuff. And I got so riled up about it, I actually didn't notice it as quickly as I normally would. And so I'm saying this because we kind of keep having these experiences until they do stop. They do stop if we're doing the work. They do end. So, you know, in Atlantis, that's what essentially this frequency did with the whatever we'd call it, hybridization of like different beings and things, and then eventual war and all that. That's essentially what that is. That frequency is constantly trying to either like use technology or weird physical material based things to like gain more power or more might or more force. More force is a better word for it. It's sort of like, it's the part of the mind that wants to set reality, set what it perceives as reality, the physical illusion, to its particular vision, basically. Which is what you'll see in the globe as that aspect, that frequency of consciousness that's working through humans is essentially trying to like globalize power, right? Globalize currency, globalize power, globalize control, so they can run the world literally and out in the open instead of like in the hidden ways. You know, so we actually are the more we all awaken, the less possible it really is to control anything. So like in the populace, the more of the populace that awakens, they set examples for people that are not necessarily awake to see that it's okay to just say, no, I'm not participating in this thing that you're doing. It's okay. I'll be fine. And then it inspires change, basically, through just peaceful standing against tyranny. So we talked a little bit yesterday about the battles and fighting and all that stuff. There's nothing really to fight, you know? We just say no, I think, to things that don't resonate. And anger actually, you know, anger is something we really want to look at, I should say, because anger in the body, if it stays in the body, it's going to cause distortion in the body. It's going to, unless it's being stored to be used later, which is a negative technique, it's going to cause the cells, everything moves too fast. It generates heat. Anger is another way to see it. So that everything erodes. You die faster the more angry you are. Literally. So when we're having anger, it doesn't mean, I don't want to spook people because we get angry. It's fine. It's when the anger sits in us, like we want to let it go through us. And then there's also like an actual like kind of righteous anger that, you know, that's when it makes sense for us to be angry. Something is so turned against the Christ light in us that it makes perfect sense for us to be angry. Perfect sense. It's perfectly sensible to be upset about this thing. We just want to know, we want to have ways to let that anger out healthily. I like to use heavy metal music, personally. And just rage out at some really angry metal, basically. That helps me a lot. It's one of my most useful tools, honestly, because as a man, often we have this sort of, when we get emotionally disturbed, we respond with an emotion of anger. We almost convert it into anger, a fiery action force, because of our masculinity, right? And actually, like, women are doing this too a lot. Like when we're emotionally reactive in anger, that's what's happened, is our masculine's kind of taken over a bit, right? But it's powered by our feminine receipt of and love. Like love powers the anger. So, like you could frame it like that. But so we want to let it flow through us when we have anger, and then we want to try to notice, where did that exactly come from as well? And is there something that I can do to help set things right that's peaceful, right? We want to stay aligned with peace, obviously. You know, is this a time I should stand up and say no to aid another? Like, no, this is not okay. Or like, you know, these are some of the balancing things that we'll experience as we start to approach like more heightened awareness, where we're not judging that these people have done these things necessarily, but we still are angry at consciousness itself almost for this disturbing thing occurring, right? And this is where some of our biggest shadow is. And the biggest one is the self-deception that we separated from God. That's the biggest one. That is probably the deepest subconscious one. And it's good that it's veiled that way, because it's a very painful one. Because we hold this deep resentment. Is one word we could use. Like, we resent our Creator for letting us leave, sort of. For allowing this to happen this way. There's a part of us, that almost all of us, that's kind of raging against that. And it's deep, and it's okay. It's okay. It's very normal. But it's part of the reason is we veil that wounding gets veiled at the birth process, essentially. All that raging happens as we're born, and then it kind of gets veiled. And then we get to remember pieces of that in different ways, usually over time. And then we eventually will have a big release. And we'll remember that the separation was like make-believe. Ta-da! That's what it's sort of like. And when we have that realization, most people that I've talked to just usually get a boisterous laugh, like laughing and crying usually. And it's interesting. It's like I've always wanted to figure out how to teach that, but we can't. It's like these self-revelation experiences. But they come from this work, so we can talk about the work. And actually, for me, the focus on these things actually, for me, is that really the only thing that really has my attention. Everything else is, I do it in life, like take care of my children, I love them, I do all the normal things, but my real conscious focus is just on this, pretty much, just on this process of ego cleansing. If I'm honest, that's pretty much all I do. And there are some ways I do it better than others. But I'm going to jump into the chat now. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate you all. You guys are all amazing. Hello, Trevor. Hello, Theodora. Hello, E. E says, why do you personally think we feel frustrated sometimes when we listen to spiritual people speak sometimes? Basically because there's two main reasons that I've noticed. One is they're drawing attention to a place of our ego that we don't want to look at yet. So we will think, this person's like, when I first saw, what's his name, Phil Good, he speaks at a pretty high level most of the time. And he was talking about being a dot is one of the things that helped make him big. When I started to watch that, I was just like frustrated by what he was saying. It was all frustrating me. And at that time, it was because I wasn't ready to understand what he was saying at that time. This was like right after my awakening, and during a weird phase where I didn't understand what was going on. So when I was listening to that and stuff, it didn't make any sense, and that made me upset with him. And not upset with him, but like, no, this doesn't vibe with me. I don't like the vibe. Like, kind of just made excuses and wandered away from it. Came back to it later and was like, oh yeah, this guy's a genius. Good for him. Someone sent it to me later. I saw it. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this, but I didn't understand it before. But the other thing is that we develop our spiritual ego. So the mind constantly is like comparing, they are this way and I'm this way. And if they seem to be doing something a little better than me, that can be quite triggering. In the spiritual sense, I think it's because it has to do with our personal power and our personal connection to God. And when we see what appears to be like a more connection to God in another, that drives us nuts. That's what we want, and they seem to have it. That's one of the primary things that's happening. And then we make a story about that and why that's whatever. Or we're not ready for the teaching. It's one or the other. Usually it's something like that. So it's really good to notice it, because that's where we're telling ourselves that this other person I'm watching has more of a divine connection than I do. That's not true. That couldn't be true, right? So it's helpful to notice these things. But and also some people don't really experience much of this. But you'll notice the mind as well wants to discredit the teacher. You'll notice if you watch it, as you're watching the spiritual teacher, it wants to find reasons that the spiritual teacher is full of shit. Oh, a big one for me is like I smoke cigarettes. So it'd be easy for somebody to just point at that and say that means that he's not pure or some weird whatever. And all of those opinions would be fine. It doesn't make a difference. But the mind essentially looks for the flaw to lower down the other as much as it can so that it's more comfortable. Sometimes it's wanting to raise itself above the other even. Like, oh, well, they say it this way and I would say it that way, and they're wrong then. Or whatever, just these types of things, which is fine. It's fine to do it. The mind is sort of meant to like take some information in and swish it around and discern what feels good in the heart, what doesn't. Like, that's kind of what it's all for, right? It's only when we're like directing it at the other. Like, I always found it strange that people get upset at spiritual teachers. Although even I do still, like the ones that are spouting nonsense, those ones bug me. But ones that are truly trying, that really I can tell they're trying their best and they're doing what they feel is good for humanity and good for spiritual evolution. I feel bad for those people. Not bad for them, but I care about how society treats them because they're treated pretty poorly a lot of times, and it's not very evident. It's not usually very evident. A lot of the things that happen are like weird things. I don't know how to describe it. They seem to get focused on by the societal mind in different ways, and then discredited, and all these other things, or compared against old teachings, new teachings, and it's all like basically different minds just having opinions about these things. So that's part of it. Is like that's the other thing, is the spiritual teacher might be saying something that like goes against a dogmatic belief. So if there's like a dogmatic belief structure of this means this, and then that's all it could mean, and then the spiritual teacher diverges from that, that's another thing. But that's kind of that's the same thing that I was talking about with the mind trying to say I'm right, I know better than them. It's the same thing, really. But it could be rooted in just personal power, or it could be rooted in very attached to the concepts and beliefs that we've created. So yeah, that would be like my thoughts on it. He says, you're right. I've discovered I've had attachments to some of my shadow aspects, so much so I used some of them sort of as crutches in life, being dependent on them. Yeah, exactly. Like embracing some of our shadow things is like, this is my armor almost. Like for me, it was like my coldness in a way for a time. My ability to just detach, like unemotional, is what actually spurred my awakening. But I wore that sort of as an armor, like my ability to just shut the world off, sort of, which would be like a unhealthy sort of negative kind of thing. But now I've learned to make it a good thing as well. So it's actually changed into a more positive thing. Now I can transition that into loving non-attachment. I fall into nothing now instead of trying not to exist. It's a little different, right? Chad says, hi, Chad. I like the analogy of ego death being like an ice cube in a glass of water, separate, dissolving into the one by shining away. Yeah. That's a good idea. I like that thought. Yeah, it goes away, but you're still the water. Like you're still the same. You still have mind stuff. You're still doing stuff at varying degrees. And then that shifts too. And then it becomes a little, it's non-linear mind, but it's still the same kind of thing. It still has to be someone, right? Like it still has to be the one expressing as Sean or the one expressing as Chad. Otherwise, what's it doing? What are we even doing? Right? I'm a savior, you're a savior, everyone's a savior. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, TG. Compassion is not consent. We're learning to transmute. Yeah, exactly. Compassion is not consent. No, definitely not. Definitely not. We can observe, like when someone's being negative towards us, we can respond with compassion and still say no. Like we can hold compassion in our heart and then still demonstrate no, though. We don't have to show compassion if we don't want to. If we don't feel that showing compassion is appropriate. If you show compassion to someone that is not wanting to receive any of that, it is not necessarily going to help, right? So, I mean, it's a balancing act, but we'll traverse some of these experiences usually, where people are being weird, and we compassionately just say no thank you, and we just know that their weirdness, what they're doing is coming from their own fear, their own lack of awareness of self. It's coming from their own disconnection right now and disharmony right now. They don't have to be characterized as being the type of person who or anything. We don't have to do any of that. Just right now, that person's nuts. So no, right? Does that make sense? That's how I try to frame it, I would say. Susan says the harsh self-critic will always criticize others. Yeah, that's the other thing too. The critical voice that comes out is our own inner critic that's criticizing us. You know, judge not lest ye be judged means there's no one to judge but you. Therefore, whatever criticisms or judgments you have of reality are all about you. All of it. So that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of stuff. I have a lot of thoughts about reality. That's why this process needs to be gentler. That's what I'm trying to advocate for. It needs to be more comical, maybe. Haha, I got really angry. Haha. That type of thing. If we can. If we can. And we can't always, and that's okay. Heidi Rose. Hi, Heidi. After my awakening, I would watch spiritual teachers, and it would send me into a state of rage, weeping and screaming, the discomfort and frustration with the birthing process and not having reached the other side. Yeah. Yeah. Well, good for you for sticking with it in the face of all of that frustration as well, though. Good for you. I felt like that reading some of Dr. Hawkins' work. And like, it was like, sometimes I would get, for me, it was mostly just pissed off at myself. So pissed off at myself. So I'd have to step away from it for a minute, because he's so bang on with his work, so accurate in the mind. And he was a psychologist or psychiatrist, I think. Yeah, psychiatrist. He was MD, PhD. And he had clearly essentially seen all of the ego, more or less, like, and wrote about it all. So reading through that material was, yeah, kind of like that for me. It was kind of frustrating. And then I would intersperse some of that material with like a little bit of Course in Miracles to help bring me back to like the remembering perfection. So I would kind of go back and forth a bit. Love, wisdom, nurturing, wisdom. That's how I try to balance my intake at the time when I was doing some of the learning that tends to happen, some of the reading and stuff, and the books that end up getting thrown into your midst. It's quite magical how you know how it all unfolds. But E says, Susan, that's why I think it's important to recognize that you're special first, and then knowing that everyone else is too, going back to previous chat. Yeah, you said that yesterday, I think, right? Yeah, we have to realize, I mean, we can go either way, but it's better to realize the Christ or the specialness in us first and help us birth that in ourselves above anything else, really. Like, still doing what we need to do in our life, but as far as trying to see the good in others, or something like that, we can do that, but first we have to see it in ourselves to be able to see it in them properly anyway. So we can kind of work it backwards and see it in them first, which helps us to then see it in us. But I would say, it, like E says, it's better to empower the self first. This is why actually self-empowerment teaching, like things like Tony Robbins, are like a big thing and are starting to phase out a bit more as everyone's starting to back away from all the go energy. They're more, the society itself has been like empowered. And the side effect of that is that the ego gets empowered. We develop the spiritual ego even just from that empowerment stuff. Like, I will get what I want, bah, 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 kind of energy. But there's a purpose to that, which is to build esteem, to realize that I have the power within me to do whatever I want, and all that stuff. It's all great. It's all great until the world like isn't going the way we want and we're flipping out. It's great until we're freaking out, and then we turn to God. Or we just flip out until we pass away, I guess. But that's basically the trajectory of it, is that self-empowerment causes us, because we're into the attachment of things and the reality and the, we're without realizing, we're codependently attached to all this stuff, all this external stuff. We're getting our power and investing ourselves in all of this stuff. And then it stops working the way we want it to work, because we've elevated our self-empowerment and whatever, but now we're still seeing our value in the world around us instead of just seeing it in here. The world will not meet the value we're realizing in ourselves. It's not going to meet it yet. So that causes us to be pissed or upset in some way. Yeah, basically. Mudchat says, as far as compassion is not consent on the larger world, that gets pulled into that control sphere. It's like, oh, thanks, but no. Good day, and be on your merry way. We transmute as we go. Yeah, basically. Yeah. E says, I think true sovereignty is attained by independence, working away from dependence on the powers that be, and working towards self-dependence. So it really doesn't matter what they do. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And some of us will be more oriented to do that like in a physical way. Like maybe we leave society sort of, like just get a place and start making our own vegetable, or growing our own vegetables and doing things like that. Like we might physically do these things. And then others of us just shift it sort of in the mind or whatever. For some of us to feel sovereign, we have to be like totally self-reliant in the environment, right? But for some of us to feel self-reliant, like the way that I frame my reliance or dependence is that I depend on the Christ, the light that feeds me, or the light that I drink of. Everything else, it couldn't sustain me properly. It's something there for me to experience. But when that experience is gross, then I have to learn when to stand and say no, basically. So the dependence, like, for example, like, for example, one of the ways that I frame it just for myself is like, if I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to eat, I'm essentially worried that the Creator won't feed me. It seems like we go out and feed ourselves with our food and whatever, right? It seems like that. But all of that doingness of stuff is like more like we've created that illusion that we need to go do these things. So I'm not saying that we should sit here and pop a piece of a Pop-Tart into our hands magically. But what I mean is that whatever we receive is received from the Creator, is the way I try to see it. So whatever we receive is right for me, sort of thing. In a way. And if I don't think the Creator will feed me, then perhaps I won't live. So, am I okay with that? It sort of becomes like an understanding that we don't really know if we're even going to live tomorrow, I guess. So, there's not much sense in worrying. I have food for now, right? I have no way to get more food, let's say, but I have food for now, and I'm alive now, right? So the dependence, I think, for me, is trying to come into the connection inside, if we can. I'm not saying that I do this all the time. And certainly I'm dependent on a lot of things in my life for it to function properly. A lot of things and people for me to feel comfortable. Like if I suddenly couldn't see my kids or something, that would be a nightmare for me. These things would bother me a lot, right? So certainly we all have whatever those things are. And yeah, I think that's where we're gonna stand up. Like those things that we don't want to not have in our life is where we'll stand up and we'll assert our perhaps saying no to something, right? Where it comes into that aspect of our life. So for me, it'd be probably my children. Like if the government started trying to do something really weird with children, I would probably just say no. That type of thing. So yeah, so I think it's important. And like you said, true sovereignty is independence. I would say like independence in the way that like nothing could affect me even. Like it all is of my will. So nothing even could really affect me is like the purest sovereign entity. And this would be like a master type consciousness, right? To know their sovereignty so much that even the water won't let them sink into it. Even the weather will settle if they want it to. You know, so I like to hold those things because I know that those are the highest, at least for me, what I've seen, the highest degrees of truth of some of these concepts that I've encountered. So sovereignty will look like kind of a certain way to us, depending on wherever we are at in that spectrum of development or ascension. So it first shows up usually like in the world, like how are we sovereign in the world and independent in the world? Then also it shows in the mind, how are we independent? How are we independent in the mind? Do we let other people influence everything we think? What about our behavior, right? Like there's sovereignty in all of that, really, right? And the full melding of all of that is the activation of the God self, or the God, the walking God, more or less, the avatar. When everything is pure sovereign, then one is essentially going to be able to do as one wishes, because the will itself of creation will sing with you. Jesus said once, I really like this. The Pharisees, I think, were telling Jesus to tell the crowd to be quiet or something. And Jesus said, if we silence the crowd, the mountains themselves will sing, or the rocks themselves will sing. Like the creation itself will buzz with the harmony of this master and the vibrational frequencies that start to come about when someone's in that state, or an avatar is doing its thing, doing its miracle conduit stuff. When it's being its pylon of light, the whole creation around it sings with its will. So obviously, like, we're in a stage here where most of us, if we're going to we're just working on this at all, it takes, like I said, there's so much stuff to clean up. It often takes us lifetimes, but a lot of us might feel like we're probably done. Like this feels like it's the last go around. And that's really cool. Really cool. Cypress Hill. Our own journey illuminates others' journey. Yeah, absolutely. Jessica Lynn says, I went bananas and then I put on some awesome music and blasted all the nonsense away. Exactly. There you go. Aaron L. Hey, Aaron L. Jessica says, it's neat to be here now with all of you. This is incredible. You are amazing. Thank you. You're amazing. Thank you, E. Fresh take on self-reliance. Yeah. I'm glad it resonated. I think like all self-dependence is like really important. However we are experiencing it. And yeah, it's a good discussion. Mud Chat says being present in the moment, allowing it to let us exercise our spiritual sense and growth. And by the way, yes, so great to be here with you now with you all. Yeah, just allowing the moment to be with us. It's so simple. It's so simple. That's why when we have some of the bigger pops of awakening, we usually just laugh at how simple it is. And even after that, we can then forget again and like get sucked back into the mind and stuff. So it's kind of a weird wash cycle, brainwash. And that's kind of what awakening is, right? We're kind of brainwashing ourselves, cleaning our brains up. Aaron L says, it feels like that to me, last run around this life. Not sure how it feels that way. Yeah, I'm not sure either. It sort of feels like that for me. I don't know. I try not to worry about the future too much. But it does feel like that for me, pretty much, yeah. I don't know why or what. I don't try to make sense of it anymore. It takes too long. Oh, happy I love you day. I think that's time. That's the alarm. That's time for me to go. Thank you guys for tuning in. Just over an hour now. I appreciate you. I think just to try to bring your good intentions of peace and harmony is really all we have to do. And then we laugh at ourselves when we notice that the mind wants to do something that's different than that. And we try not to do those things. And then we try to make sure we stop thinking that way. But that's it, simplified. Thank you all. I appreciate all the chat. Everyone's amazing, as always. Take care.